We had Nick Saban, we had Jimbo Fisher, we had a great hullabaloo, and you know how rarely I use that word, around all that, and they went at each other's throats. And then you remember I came on the show Thursday and I said, you know, they kind of agreed on the most important point, that whole we think we may need the federal government to come in because the NCAA can't legislate on its own. Well, after Thursday's show, obviously, when you do a show like that, you get a whole lot of phone calls from a whole bunch of people. And I have probably spent more time over the past 48 to 72 hours discussing things like NIL than I ever wanted to. I don't talk about NIL on the show a whole lot because the numbers say you don't care about it. But I do find it to be my duty to be informed about it if and when you and I do need to discuss it, like last week. Well, it turns out that I think this whole Saban versus Jimbo thing is going to end up paying dividends for us as a show, for you guys as viewers and listeners, for me, because I think that I probably learned enough this week and heard enough of what I needed to hear to tell you I actually feel a whole lot better about where college football is headed than I ever did a week ago, a month ago, even a year ago. But you're going to have to follow me here. Because see, Nick Saban, Jimbo Fisher, like I said, that was sort of ancillary to the bigger point. This whole, how do we fix college football moving forward? How do we make sure these problems are addressed? And there are many problems out there. This specific one is about NIL and what teams should be able to do and shouldn't be able to do. But you know all that. You've been watching that. But here's where I think most people's heads are at, including our audience, because I know enough of you and talk to enough of you to know this. You're probably confused by a lot of this stuff. You know on the surface what the main points are, and you know sort of the storylines, but when you get down into the weeds on this stuff, maybe you're in college and you don't have time to pay attention. Maybe you work at Jiffy Lube in Murfreesboro and you don't have time to pay attention to this stuff. And you hear things like NCAA, and then you hear NIL, and then you hear Supreme Court, the Alston case. You hear TV deals and new contracts, and it sounds like 5 or 6 different stories, doesn't it? But you hear all of it thrown into this jumbled mess anytime stories like this pop up, and you probably sit there, if you're like me, you probably think, how is this all connected? You know what? Forget it. I'm not even going to try and understand it. I'll just take whatever they send me. I know where to be on Saturdays in the fall, which I can't fault you for having as a strategy on this whole thing. But these aren't 5 different stories. This is all in the same blender, and it's being poured out ultimately into the same cup, and in that cup is the future of this sport. A lot of you are worried about it. I've been very worried about it. Now, I'm not saying I'm about to totally ease your mind or fears, but I'm telling you, based on some conversations I had this week, I feel better about parts of the future of college football. And there's a sharp dividing line, which I'm about to explain to you, between the parts I do feel good about and the parts I don't feel good about. But if you just showed up, let's say you just showed up to the party. It's pretty easy. You can take the dummy's guide to this stuff, which we specialize in delivering on this show. For a long time, folks in college football drug their feet. They didn't want to pay players anything. And whether it was a university president or a conference commissioner or the head of the NCAA, they stonewalled this thing. And here's what it's like. If you're part of our college audience, it's like being in a group and you got a project due. And if you're like me, back in the day, I was one of those that looked to my left and right and understood that if I looked to my left and right long enough, someone was going to take the lead. I didn't want to take the lead on the group project. I'll lead in other facets of life, but not scholastically. I'll participate. I'll be a role player. I'm probably not going to be your leader. Well, no one stepped up. In the college group project, no one stepped up. And so what happened is we got that little can there and we just kicked it further down the road. And all of a sudden, we had lawsuits filed. Because finally, someone looked around and said, this whole thing the NCAA tries to do, where we don't get to make money off of ourselves, but they also don't pay us anything, it seems kind of crooked, dare I say, illegal. And you know what the Supreme Court did? They agreed. And that kind of brings us to where we are today. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this whole Supreme Court thing, you don't need to go and read a lot of decisions. You don't need to read a lot of legalese. I have one graphic for you and one graphic only. It's from Brett Kavanaugh. It was part of a 9-0 SCOTUS decision, which again should just be viewed on its own as remarkable. History books will tell you this was the most divided the country's ever been in several generations, but the NCAA brought the Supreme Court together because there wasn't a single one on the bench that dissented here. Here's what Brett Kavanaugh had to say. Supreme Court opinion. The NCAA is not above the law. The NCAA couches its arguments for not paying student athletes in innocuous labels. But the labels cannot disguise the reality. Dunk, dunk, dunk. My words, not his. He continues, the NCAA's business model would be flatly illegal in almost any other industry in America. What did he say there? Well, he said just because your bylaws say it doesn't mean it's legal. He essentially agreed. Okay, so that brings us to modern day. If you missed the entire past 20 or 30 years, that brings us to modern day. The NCAA is they've been governing college athletics in a model that is unsustainable because, as it turns out, it's kind of illegal. And then you get things like NIL, because you have a terrified NCAA that even though they're looking at what's happening and understand part of that's probably illegal, we're terrified to enforce our own bylaws because that evil Supreme Court told us that it's kind of illegal, and so any lawsuit that's filed against you is probably going to lead to you paying a ton in legal fees and then more payouts in terms of lawsuits that are won against you. So after all that, we sit here today in the year of our Lord, 2022, in the middle of May, and we got a big mess on our hands, don't we? Now, you remember last Thursday when this whole Saban and Jimbo thing blew up, and I sat on the show. I went on Jason Whitlock's show the next day. Cannell and I did his show. We appreciate him having us on, and we furthered that discussion. And the discussion was, where are we going? How's this ultimately going to be solved? Because it feels unsustainable. Like Nick Saban said that. I agree with him. Jimbo and Nick Saban both called for federal reform. Greg Sankey and George Klykoff, the SEC and Pac-12 commissioners, respectively, went to Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago. What are they calling for? To be clear, they are calling for Congress to basically give college football antitrust exemption, kind of like Major League Baseball's had for a long time. And that's basically the federal government saying, they touch you on the forehead with a magic wand and they say you don't have to operate under the same letter of the law that normal businesses do. Now, you've heard me up until last week on this show say that I think that's the only real sustainable avenue. That's the only path down which we can go where we get to keep college football with some semblance of what you and I have grown up knowing it as. But the more I have conversations, the more I think a couple of things. Number one, I don't think it has to go that route. And number two, I don't think it's going to go that route. Okay? If you're like me, you have a natural inclination to recoil anytime anyone suggests that the federal government's going to come in and save anything, much less something I care about a great deal, which is college football. So I never liked making the argument, but now I have more good news. I don't have to make the argument. And that leads me to the conversations I had this week. So, without naming names, some very influential people, powerful people, some decision-making kinds of people reached out, and also some people who work in courtrooms for a living reached out. And I had some really productive conversations this week. I don't think the leaders in college football who are calling for federal help expect to get federal help at all. That's the first point. I think it's a Hail Mary approach, but there's a clear inflection point. It's a clear fork in the road moment for college football. Path A is, federal government, they save us with the antitrust exemption, but it's just that. It's a Hail Mary. I don't think the leaders, whether it be Greg Sankey or George Klykoff or anyone in Indianapolis, I don't think for a second they expect the federal government to actually bail them out. They'd love it if it happened. They don't expect it. What is the second path? What's plan B? That's where I think the SEC is about to take a massive lead, and I think the Big Ten is going to take a massive lead. How do you control NIL? Absent the federal government giving you antitrust exemption, how do you enforce rules that they themselves at the federal level have said are illegal? Well, the answer is you don't do it nationally. You remove the power that really never should have been placed in the NCAA's hands to the extent it was, and you bring it back to the conference level where it always should have been. If you're in an American government class, you view a lot of this as the nationalist versus states' rights approach. Well, it's the same way in college football. The SEC and the Big Ten are perfectly positioned to take this thing by the throat. How do you control NIL? How do you control rogue boosters and rogue programs? You don't look to Indianapolis to enforce. You don't look to them to govern. You look to your conference office to do it, because a conference office has far more flexibility because they get out of being accused of that M word on their forehead, monopoly. You can be a lot more heavy-handed at the conference level. But number two, you need to know a very important figure. The SEC has already entered into a new media rights deal that kicks in 2024. The Big Ten's about to announce one probably within the next month. if the guidance that we're getting is any indication. Here's what it means for those schools and those conferences. Right around the corner, there is coming a time where just because you play in the SEC or the Big Ten, you get around $100 million per year just from media rights deals. You know what you do with that? You look at the 6-foot kid and the 5-foot kid standing in an empty pool here, and you don't tell the 6-foot kid to get down on his knees to make it even anymore. You just fill the pool up with 10 feet of water, and they're both floating. Neither one of them touch the ground anymore. And sure, the 6-foot kid probably still has a little height advantage just because his upper torso is higher. But if you take that television money and you enter into revenue sharing agreements with your student athletes, maybe even not having to label them employees in the process if you're creative enough, then all of a sudden, you don't do away with NIL. What you do is you do away with a lot of what NIL is right now, which is Wild West, straight up recruiting inducement money. And in the process, you take care of your student athletes. And in doing that, you garner a lot of goodwill with them. And you give them money that, quite frankly, they should have access to anyway and probably should have quite a while ago. But in return, you know what you get to do? As a conference, forget the NCAA, as a conference, you get to then enjoy all the accolades out on the stage, but then when you get behind the curtain, you jerk all of those 14 athletic directors and head coaches, or 16 if you're the SEC, in the same room, and you say, that's the way it's going to be as far as they're concerned, they being the public. But as far as you're concerned, here are the letters of the laws in these respective conferences, and if you're found to be outside of them, then we will come down on you. And you're not going to be saved from lawsuits. If your boosters aren't in line, forget about Indianapolis. We're coming down on you at the conference level, and you will pay a premium. The Supreme Court won't have anything to say about it because that's not a monopoly. That's not a national approach. That is very much a conference by conference approach. And if you don't like it, turn in your resignation papers. If you don't like it in the SEC or the Big Ten, go try your luck in the Big 12. Go try your luck in the ACC or the Pac-12, which brings me to my next point, and why I said I feel good about some of the future of college football here. I did not address those 3 conferences yet. Their media deals will lag well behind in terms of average revenue per year relative to the 2 big boys by a mile, those being the SEC and the Big Ten. That's my next question, and I don't have an answer for you right now. I don't know what those conferences are going to do. I'll tell you, I feel very confident in the not too distant future at the SEC and the Big Ten essentially solving the NIL problem by, in a de facto nature, getting into the NIL game. I mean, in a lot of cases, if you're offering kids the equivalent of what their parents' annual salary probably is per year in just attendance money, if you get $50,000 or $60,000 a year, 1 through 25 in the signing class, doesn't matter if you're starter or not, if you're on the roster, if you're on scholarship there, and you get that kind of money, boy. And also, since you have the flexibility because you're controlling it, what if you added incentives to access that money and backloaded it so that it de-incentivizes transferring? I think the transfer portal would be a lot less busy at that point. And here's a radical concept for those who want to maintain the academic integrity portion of college athletics. What if you incentivized graduation? You know, what if there was, however you want to structure it, some sort of a backloaded lump sum annuity that's paid at the end when you walk across that stage in a cap and gown? All of these things are possible. So you see, what you can do at the conference level is much different than what the NCAA can't do at the national level. People have to lead. What I just said is not easy. I'm just telling you it's doable. It's not going to be easy, but it's doable. They've got to do it in the SEC. They've got to do it in the Big Ten. And then the great unknown to me, and it's kind of where we're going to end the segment, is what will the other power conferences do? Some of them are locked in long-term media deal rights that even if they wanted to do something that matches what these conferences, I suspect, are going to do, they really don't have the power to. That's the shruggy emoji, okay? I'm not all the way there. I'm just a little ways down the road and thinking I understand where this is probably headed. And if those conferences structure this the right way, I don't think that the future of college athletics has to be nearly as slimy and dirty as the crystal ball has led you to believe it may. You know, if you've got a steady structure where upon being admitted to play at Arkansas, you know no matter what your position, no matter what your star ranking, you get a certain amount of money. You are incentivized to stick it out. You are incentivized to graduate. It's what college athletics has always been about. You're just putting more money in someone's pocket now, but there's still the same incentive. You've still got as level a playing field as you can have. Okay, Alabama's still going to have an advantage over Missouri because they're Alabama and Missouri. But it's not this state of affairs that we have right now. Okay, that's the best I can do for you. I think that's where we're headed. A lot of informed people behind the scenes think that's where we're headed. A lot of university presidents, I'm very emphatically banging on the table right now, are, I think, more on board with this than they were. And as it was explained to me, that's kind of been the key. You know, those are the great anonymous names in the room, whereas everyone knows the president of the NCAA at any given time, or maybe even the names of conference commissioners. Those university presidents, they gotta hold up their end of the deal too. I think they're going to be on board with it because they know what the alternative is. The alternative is just the cliff breaks off and it falls off into the abyss and then it washes away into the ocean. Well, we can't have that. Okay, there's obviously way too much money on the line for that. So I think that reasonable minds will prevail here. There will be some creativity. There'll be a lot more flexibility because this will be handled at the conference level. And I guess unlike shows in the past, I do think the sport's still going to be here when we get to 2030.